Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and to click on that bell notification button. That way when we are doing our thing, YouTube lets you know. Today we're going to continue my top 100 board games of all time, and in particular, we're breaking into the top 50 of all time. Today I'll be covering games 50 through 41. So let's get straight to it. My number 50 board game of all time was on my list last year, ranked as high as number 38. So considering all the new games I played, it's not a big drop at all. My number 50 is Puerto Rico, designed by Andreas Seyfarth and published by Rio Grande Games. This is a true classic within the hobby, a game that was ranked for over 5 years at number 1 on BoardGameGeek.com, and it's ranked currently number 50 on my list. Players are producing goods in their boards representing their section of Puerto Rico, and they are shipping those goods back to the motherland in order to get victory points. Now, from turn to turn, there's a variable phase order action selection sequence where players, the active player or the starting player, who's known as the governor, starts by selecting one of the available roles, right? And the amount of roles that are available are dependent on the player count. And then in clockwise order, each player is going to take their role. And what happens is when you take a role, that role gives everybody, including the player who chose it, a special benefit, an action that they can take in clockwise order. But the player who actually chose the specific action gets a little bonus. So the key to this game is trying to pick these actions when it's most convenient to you, right? You don't want to do someone the favor of picking an action that's actually more beneficial to them than to you, because then basically your turn just serves as an additional turn for them. So you really want to map that out as much as possible. Now, sometimes you do find yourself in a catch-22 where, yes, you do kind of have to pick the lesser of two evils and perhaps do something that benefits someone slightly more than you, but you also want to make sure that at least you are benefiting greatly from that decision as well. This game, I would say, has aged very, very well. It's still a very smooth, elegant design almost 20 years later. This was originally published back in 2002. There are some additions, some modern additions that look a little bit better as far as graphic design. My edition is not quite so lucky, but at the end of the day, I don't play this game because it's a looker. I play because I enjoy the gameplay experience, and my wife and I in particular have a really good time playing this game. My number 50 board game of all time, Puerto Rico. Now we move on to my number 49, and my number 49 is Tiny Epic Galaxies, designed by Scott Alms and published by Gameland Games. This game is new to my list for this year. This is perhaps the most popular of the Tiny Epic games. Basically, players are trying to colonize different planets that give them a certain amount of victory points, and also once it becomes part of their personal intergalactic empire, these planets have special abilities that they can use going forward. And you're rolling these dice every turn, from turn to turn, and it's a roll and lock mechanism. Well, it's not really roll and lock. It's really roll and resolve actions. Because what's happening is you can do a little bit of Yahtzee style re-rolling, but you only get one free re-roll per turn. Any additional re-roll, you need to use a particular resource or currency in this game that is reserved or called energy. And every time you roll one of these lightning bolts on your dice, you accrue energy as long as you are on planets or intergalactic systems that produce that resource, which is the energy resource. And again, throughout the game, you're using the energy for certain things. You're using them to increase your empire level, which ultimately unlocks more dice for you to roll. It unlocks more ships, more spaceships for you to manipulate. And it also gives you some more victory points towards your end game goal of winning the game. So the energy allows you to raise your energy, your empire levels, but they also, again, allow you to buy some more rerolls. And you're doing lots of different things throughout the game. Sometimes you could piggyback off other people's turns by using an additional resource that's referred to as culture. You're manipulating all these things. Sometimes you do not want to colonize a planet, but perhaps you want to touch down on it and land on it in order to trigger a one-time special ability that helps you, or perhaps hurts one of your opponents. This game has a really excellent solo mode with a highly competent AI opponent. And it has 5 different varying levels of difficulty for that AI opponent. So you could find your comfort zone. There's a wide spectrum to cover different ranges of abilities of how good you may be as an individual player. Really cool. My number 49 board game of all time, Tiny Epic Galaxies. And speaking of Tiny Epic, my number 48 board game of all time, also new to the list this year, is Tiny Epic Western, also designed by Scott Alms, also published by Gameland Games. This game just beat out Tiny Epic Galaxies for me. And big disclaimer, just before I go any further, is that I recognize that Tiny Epic Galaxies is a smoother, more streamlined, and perhaps better game design than Tiny Epic Western. However, this game is able to edge out Tiny Epic Galaxies for me because A, I like the theme better. I personally like the romanticized Wild West theme a little bit more than I like the science fiction space exploration theme. Also, I like some of the mechanisms here that are not, employed in Tiny Epic Galaxies. For example, I really like worker placement. I like the stock market kind of feel that this game has to it, where you're acquiring shares in 3 different industries throughout the game as you're buying these buildings, and you get to score points based on if you're the primary or secondary, depending on the player count, owner of these respective shares. But at the same time, you're manipulating the market, because as the game progresses, you're making decisions, if you're in the position of advantage to do so, you're making decisions that increase the value of these different industries. So you're trying to find the right balance of having a lot of shares in one industry, but making sure that that industry is worth it at the end of the game. Really cool. There's some nice, neat city building that's taking place, because you're building all these different cities, all these different buildings that make up a city and do different things for you and give you different special abilities. Each player has a special character card that makes them unique to the other players. There's not so much of that in Tiny Epic Galaxies. Again, Tiny Epic Galaxies, as the more streamlined game, definitely has a more intuitive, or I guess smoother solo variant than this game does, because there are some fiddly aspects to this. But even the solo play is fun, because you more or less know exactly what the AI player is going to do. They're a truly competent opponent, and there is ways of raising the difficulty level as far as playing them is concerned. Really cool, fun game. I always have a good time playing it, whether it's with other people or solo. My number 48 board game of all time, Tiny Epic Western. Number 47 board game of all time is 7 Wonders Duel, designed by Bruno Cathala and Antoine Bauza. This was actually ranked number 17 for me last year, so it has dropped 30 spots. And one of the reasons why is because, honestly speaking, the more I play it, the more I personally realize that I enjoy its big brother, 7 Wonders, more as a gameplay experience. Now, granted, this is the way to go for 2-player 7 Wonders. I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle, in between the two camps, as far as how they feel about 7 Wonders 2-player variant versus 7 Wonders Duel. Some people think that this is amazing and the other one is horrible, and some people think that the 7 Wonders variant is amazing. I think the 7 Wonders variant is very functional and very good, but definitely, optimally speaking, this is a better 2-player game. But again, I still just rather be playing 3, 4, 5-player 7 Wonders with all of its expansions over this one. I think it's a cool, neat system that they have in order to simulate the challenges of the card drafting and the imperfect information. And I like the little bit of tug of war, and I like the fact that they've made military and science so much more. Well, not science, because science was pretty impactful in the first one, but they made military mean much more in this game. You cannot just completely be a peacemaking civilization. You need to have a little bit of military strength, or a little bit of military might, in order to compete and hold back the forces of your opponent. Really cool game. I always have a really good time playing this. I've been playing the solo variant that they released, the print and play version that they released. That has been a lot of fun. And again, just having a good time playing this at 2 players, it still gives me the 7 Wonders feel. It's a quicker game than 7 Wonders is, especially, with all the expansions. So it still serves a great purpose in my collection and still has a decent spot at number 47, 7 Wonders Duel. Now we move on to my number 46 board game, and my number 46 is Carson City, the card game, designed by Xavier George. And this here is new to my list this calendar year. This is another Wild West themed game. I have an affinity for that theme. But this game is so cool. Again, you got city building. Again, I like city building. It seems like Wild West games tend to lend themselves to city building. This is the third Wild West city building themed game I have on my top 100. So basically, players are playing from round to round. There are 18 turns or 18 rounds divided into 2 eras of 9 turns apiece. And throughout the turns or throughout the games, we're drafting these cards, these parcel cards, which are divided into 4 quadrants. And each of these quadrants has some type of city building or terrain feature or maybe even a blank space. And based on the buildings they have and the different abilities that the buildings have and the different scoring benefits that the different buildings have is the way you determine their value overall in a vacuum and also their specific value to your portion of Carson City that you're building. And you're drafting these things, but what's interesting is every round, to determine the turn order of the draft, you're playing this little trick-taking auction game where each player has their own deck or hand of 9 cards in their player-specific suit. And you're placing these cards down, face down simultaneously. You're revealing them face up simultaneously. And then based on whoever had the higher ranked card, that determines the turn order. And you go from whoever played the highest ranked card to whoever played the second highest ranked card. So you're figuring all these things out because you do not get these cards back until the end of the era so that you have a fresh hand of 9 at the beginning of era number 2. So you got to know when to play your 7, when to play your 9, and what have you. But also, on top of drafting these city cards, you also have these character cards that are available. And the character cards, they score you points in different ways. They give you special abilities that you could trigger once per era. So they have great value in and of themselves. But on top of the character deck, depending on which card is on the top of that stack, you're going to have this row of the 6 different suits that are available for the cards that players might have. And this is going to tell you where the tiebreaker goes based on, from top to bottom, they rank which suit has the tie-breaking advantage for that round. So if you know that you're towards the bottom of that list, you might not want to put a high card because it might be risky and you might end up investing a really good card like a 7, an 8, or a 9 to still lose the auction because you lost the tiebreaker due to where your suit ranked on this list. So factoring all these things in is really, really neat. As you draft these different parcels, you can overlap them. You could put them next to each other and you have an imaginary 8x8 grid to work with. So there is a lot of spatial manipulation taking place, a lot of spatial intelligence being utilized in order to be efficient in this game. But along with putting them adjacent to one another, you could actually also overlap them in different configurations, as long as whatever's overlapping another card actually matches the terrain, or if a empty space is underneath it, right? An empty space can be overlapped by anything. But if you're going to overlap a city hall building, then you got to make sure the building that's on top of it, or the quadrant that overlaps on top of it, happens to be another city hall building. So it's really cool trying to manipulate this 8x8 grid. This game is really fun. It has some really nice Wild West flavor with a really cool, interesting, innovative auction bidding system. My number 46 board game of all time, Carson City, the card game. And now we move on to my number 45. And my number 45 is not new to the list this year. This game was actually ranked number 29 last year. So again, this is actually very reasonable considering, again, how many new games I played this year. My number 45 board game of all time is Taj Mahal, designed by Reiner Knizia, published by Z-Man Games, a game of power and influence in India. This is a really neat game where the board is comprised of a board of India that is divided into 12 regions. And turn by turn, or round by round, in the course of 12 rounds, we are going to visit each of those 12 regions. And it's not necessarily a sequential thing as far as spatial orientation is concerned, but instead we're going to randomly set up 12 different markets, and the markets are going to be numbered from 1 through 12, which will let us know in which order we're going to end up traveling these different regions. So players can take that into consideration. And in each region, we are vying for influence or favor with the different court officers. You got the vizier, you got the monk, you've got the princess, you've got the general, and you even got the mogul or ruler himself. And basically you're trying to vie for influence, and you're doing it through a very neat auction mechanism where players are playing down these cards that have the different symbols that correspond to said court officers. And basically your cards can have one symbol representing that officer or that personality, or it can have two symbols, and you're placing these cards down. And when you're placing them down, first of all, when you commit to one specific color, you're committed to playing cards of the same color throughout the rest of that bid, throughout the rest of that auction. However, you do have these whites which serve as wild cards, but even the whites cannot be played alone. They need to be played along with a color of the symbol that you have to match. So you're doing all these things until you either decide to drop out or until your hand and its limitations force you to drop out. But the key is, when you drop out, if you are in the lead in any of those different court officers, then you have won their favor, even though you're dropping out. So timing as far as when to drop out is very key in this game. And every time you win the favor, they allow you, for each court official that you win the favor of, it allows you to place one palace on that current region within India. And no matter how many palaces you put on that turn, you're only going to get 1 point. However, if you're able to branch out and create a network that connects and moves into and through different regions, you'll score an additional point for every other region that connects to the current region in which you just built. You also are collecting different resources from the market, and these points that you get points from these resources. You can continue to collect these points in future turns, because every time you collect another resource, you not only score points for those resources, but for any other in your supply that you have already scored previously. So they keep on scoring for you. Really cool, really neat game with lots of really intricate and neat mechanisms. My number 45 board game of all time, Taj Mahal. Now we move on to my number 44, and my number 44 is Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, designed by Uwe Rosenberg and published by Lookout Games. This is a 2-player only, smaller, abbreviated version of the big, massive Euro worker placement game, Agricola. Now, in this game, it has taken and stripped lots of the things from Agricola, mechanically speaking and strategically speaking. First of all, here, there is no emphasis or concern on the raising and growing of your family. There is no emphasis on the expanding and modifying of your house. You can do a little bit of modifications to your house, but that's not really the point of the game. You're also not planting any crops or any veggies. That's not happening in this game. The only thing you're doing in this game is the animal husbandry. You're trying to breed and raise as much livestock as possible, and you're trying to create the space via expansions of your boards, buying special buildings, buying stables, buying feeding trough, creating the pastures, the fenced pastures, all these different ways of optimizing your player board in order to fit as many animals as possible, because that, for the most part, along with some points from your buildings, that is, for the most part, is what's going to score you the game. Really cool, really neat, very short. This game plays in 30 minutes or less every time we play it, but it scratches that Agricola itch for us for when we don't quite have the time to play Agricola. My number 44 board game of all time, Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small. My number 43 board game of all time was on my list last year. It was ranked at number 36, so it's still doing very well on my overall rankings. My number 43 is Runebound, 3rd edition, designed by Lucas Litzinger, published by Fantasy Flight Games. This is within the Terranov universe that Fantasy Flight has created. Players take on the role of a different hero, and that hero has different characteristics, different stats, different attributes, different skills, a different speed and health threshold that they each have. And basically throughout the game, you're exploring the lands of Terranoff, going to different cities to shop for items, maybe equipment or weapons or armor. You are going on different adventures and quests that get you gold, that get you lore, which gives you more power to combat the ultimate mastermind at the end of the game. You're defeating bad guys, smaller bad guys in between to gain more gold so you can purchase things. But also, as you're defeating these and accomplishing these adventures, you gain them as trophies, which later on in the game you could use as a currency of sorts in order to learn your skills, right? Because you always have a hand of potential skills, but while they're in your hand, they have some function for you because you could use it to exert, which basically allows you to do things like continue a skill test that you may have failed at, or allows you to re-roll a die that you weren't very satisfied with. But the skills on the text of those cards are null and void until you actually pay the amount of trophies that you need for that. So later on in the game, you're acquiring these skills. So through the skills, through the weapons, and all the stuff that you acquire, you're going to be leveling up your character and being hopefully strong enough to defeat the very powerful masterminds at the end of the game. This base game here comes with 2 different masterminds. It comes with 6 different heroes. So there's a good amount of variety just from the base game alone. I love the movement mechanism where you roll these different dice, and the dice have to correspond with the different terrain features that are on the board in order for you to move through said terrain features. So you're not going to be able to move through a forest or move through a mountain unless some of the dice you roll have forest or mountain on them. I find that to be really neat. The combat mechanism is a struggle, right? It's very unique because you're actually casting or throwing these 2-sided tokens, and basically each side has something different that it does for you on combat. So you might prefer one side versus the other, and you basically have a 50-50% chance. So there's an element of control. You have a good idea of what you're going to get, right? But also it makes it a little bit more swingy, because if the opposite side of the token isn't to your favor, then you also have a 50% chance of throwing that. It's unique. You don't see it in many other games, but I find it to not be as tactically satisfying as the rolling of some dice. And listen, I am not the biggest fan of dice rolling because I quite often do very poorly in dice rolling games. But even so, I have to admit that tactically speaking, it is a fun thing to do. Just chuck some dice. So this game, that might be a little bit of a knock on the game, but the adventuring, the storyline, the story that's involved in all the different adventure cards and the different event cards that come out throughout the games, the storyline cards that come out throughout the game, it just really keeps you immersed. I think this game plays really well solo and 2 players. I probably don't want to play it more than that because the wait time in between your turn would be too long. My number 43 board game of all time, Runebound 3rd edition. And now my number 42 of all time was also on my list last year, and this was ranked number 30, so it's also hanging in there. And that is Le Havre Inland Port, designed by Uwe Rosenberg and published by Z-Man Games. I feel like I am the only person on YouTube that ever has anything to say about this game. Nice, bad, or indifferent. This game is such a cool 2-player iteration for Le Havre. Yes, there are lots of mechanical deviations from the original game design, even more so than Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small to Agricola. But I actually like and appreciate those deviations because it makes me feel like I'm playing a different game. Yes, you're still managing certain resources, which are similar to the resources you're managing in Le Havre, and you're trying to convert them, and you're trying to turn them into points, which ultimately, or coins, which are ultimately your points at the end of the game. But the way you do so is different. Instead of worker placement, you have this dial that you manipulate by every time you acquire your buildings, you place them in the 0 slot, which means currently you cannot use them. But as the rounds progress and you rotate this dial, the buildings change which sector they're on. And they might be on a sector that allows you to play that action twice or 3 times or 4 times or even 4 times and get 1 coin. So you might want to like delay your gratification and wait a little bit in order to use or utilize one of those buildings for its benefit more optimally. But the problem is your opponents could pay you 1 coin to use your building too and put it right back at 0, and then the waiting game begins all over again. Also, if you wait too long to activate one of your buildings, then it makes it to the final threshold, the final slot here on this dial, and that is actually a bad thing because it forces you to sell the building for only half its value. So not only do you lose some coin, but you also lose the ability that that building would have kept on giving you. So you want to manage that and not procrastinate too much. But this is really cool. You also have this warehouse grid here, which is how you manipulate the increase and decrease of your different resources. And sometimes you are forced to decrease or in other words, overpay because of where you find yourself on this grid, right? Because once you make it all the way to the leftmost spot, it's not just going right back to the previous column at the rightmost spot. No, because the only way you can move is leftward and downward, and you can move sometimes upward diagonally in either direction, but you cannot just go all the way from the leftmost spot to the next column. That is not a legal move. So manipulating this is quite the challenge, and I find it to be a very satisfying experience, albeit very abstracted. My number 42 board game of all time, La Havre L'Importe. Now we move on to the last game for this list, number 41, and this is new to me this year, and that is San Juan, designed by Andreas Seyfarth and published by Ravensburger Games. How convenient, how appropriate, and how ironic that I started this list talking about Puerto Rico, and I'm ending this list talking about its re-implementation or its smaller sister of a game, San Juan. Really cool. This game it takes a lot of the elements of Puerto Rico, the idea of variable phase order, choosing these different roles, everybody benefiting from them almost equally, but the person who chose the role getting a subtle advantage. But it puts it all down to cards. And quite frankly, I love card games. And this is a multi-purpose card game where your cards, first of all, they serve as your potential buildings that you're laying down, but they also serve as resources for your production buildings that you slide face down in order to indicate the fact that you own a resource of that type. And they also serve as your money because you're discarding these cards from your very same hand in order to play a card down that has a certain value. So it's really a tough situation because you find yourself with some cards that you really want to build in future turns, but at the same time, you end up having to use them for money in order to build other buildings that perhaps are more beneficial to you. Really cool, really satisfying of experience of a game. I enjoy this every time. My number 41 board game of all time, San Juan. And that's it, folks. Thank you for joining us. Please consider clicking on one of these 4 videos that you see on the screen. If YouTube is showing them to you, it's because they think there's a really good chance that you would like them. Also, check in the description down below to check out a link of my Patreon account and see how you can become a supporter of this channel and be more involved with the behind-the-scenes process. Do some research and find a tier that works for you. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.